The Bible, well, in itself, that seems quite a reasonable and possibly easy question to answer. And I suppose if you have one handy, you could say, well, it's one of these. It's a book full of scripture, holy scripture, that the Christians, the Jews, and maybe others use for historical reasons or for religious, spiritual reasons, whatever. But actually, it's a lot more than that, and that's why we're having these videos, a number of videos, which are going to go through the whole of the scriptures. But first, before we do that, what we are going to do is to have a look at how the Bible itself came to be, when they were written, who wrote them, what they were about, how they became printed in the first place, why they were chosen to be printed, and all the other historical reasons. And then after that, we'll be going on to some other videos where we will be looking at each book of the Bible right the way from Genesis through to Revelation, and in that we'll be looking at just an introduction to them at first, and then perhaps go much deeper into them later. But for now, let's start looking at what is the Bible. How did it all begin? Well, that's a great question. How did it all begin? Well, if we're looking at the Bible itself in the version we have now, which is obviously a printed document, it didn't begin like that. It didn't begin with chapters, verses, pages, didn't begin with lovely leather-bound Bibles. It actually began, which is obvious when you think about it, with the events themselves. In other words, something happened, and then somebody or a group of people wrote about those events. In a way, they're reporting, they're witness statements perhaps, or people who heard about things happening actually got to a point in the time where they wrote it down. So something happens, somebody writes about it. So it's a historical thing, really. The event happens first and then the writing. You could argue, I suppose, when we talk about the prophets, when they wrote, they were talking about things that God said was going to happen, so they were projecting forward, and the writings would project forward to the events. But generally speaking, the books and letters and documents in the Bible, the events happen and then they're wrote about. So when we go back to the first 5 books of the Bible as an example, it is said that Moses wrote them. There's a great theological debate about that, whether he did actually write them all on his own. As we will see later, I'm pretty sure you'll agree with me when we discuss that there were other people and groups of people involved in putting those books together. But for now, those first 5 books of the Bible, known by the Jewish tradition, the Judaism, as the Torah, the books of the law, they would be called, and we call them the Pentateuch. Now, they are written from covering creation and all the way through to Moses, the Exodus, and lots of other great stories. However, if Moses did write them, he lived round about, give or take a few bank holidays here and there, round about 1500 BC. And these events clearly happened well before that. So he is writing historically about what he's heard. People didn't write things down straight away. Events happened and they were passed on by word of mouth. The oral tradition, it was called. And in some cases, there's lots of things still being said, like things that Moses had, a conversation Moses had with God on Mount Sinai, are actually not written down in our scriptures. They believe there was lots of other things he spoke to God about that we don't actually have in there. But those things we do have are, in a way, what was public, what was known by the religious people, and eventually they came to a point where it was time to write it down. If you've been privileged to go to a modern day synagogue, you may well have also seen some scrolls that were written, and the scrolls were incredible things. They could be 4 or 5 foot tall. However, that's the modern ones. I wasn't there in the original ones, but if you listen and read carefully through the scriptures, they must have had some handheld scriptures as well. So the scroll that you can see on the attached picture may well have been more the local type scroll, where there's a section of scripture written down, an event that's happened. And the particular one that's been quoted there is from Isaiah, and we read in the New Testament where the scroll was passed to Jesus. So you can imagine if it was a 4 or 5 foot scroll, he would have struggled on his own to open that up and read it. So it would almost certainly have been a handheld scroll. The language, Hebrew, was written from right to left. That's right, not left to right as we write. So they would have read from right across back, just as we do, only the other way around basically, and would have held the scroll in right hand and open with the left hand, so it opened out as they went to read it. And that's exactly what he done. He just stood up, held that scroll, read that lovely passage, the Spirit of the Lord is upon thee, and then closed it up and sat down. So our first texts were on scrolls. Anyone in that period of time who were fortunate to have some of the scripture written down, it would have been written down, and one mistake and the whole thing would have been destroyed. These scrolls could take years to get right. They weren't allowed to use the word God for a start off, and if they did that accidentally, the whole scroll would have been useless. Years and years of works, one person possibly writing the whole thing down. And it was from those scrolls, they may have been copied onto other scrolls and on and passed on, and different people in different places would have ended up with those scrolls that were written down, the words that were written down, until we get to the point where there's hundreds, if not thousands of scrolls all over the place. And we'll discuss that later. How do we know which ones we want in our Bible? Which ones out of all those possibly thousands of scrolls were the ones that were chosen to be in our Bible today? So that'll be for another time in a few moments when we move on into the scriptures. But for now, this is where it began. The events took place. They were passed on orally. The tradition was passed on and eventually written down, which brings it to us today. What a great gift.